Hello. Welcome to the lecture on the High Renaissance. This is maybe the heart of the entire history of creativity course, because those people that we think of as being most creative are the subject of the lecture today. Let's start with Leonardo da Vinci. He was a marvelous observer of the world, and he was able to sketch it and think about it and devise new ways of manipulating it and conceiving it. He was just an expert in so many areas that we think of him as the first Renaissance man. There were many others who lived before him who were experts in many fields, but he is the epitome of this many-field expert, and therefore we call him a Renaissance man. One of the interesting things he did is he was left-handed, he wrote with backward script. It's easy to read in a mirror, but it was his own little code, and I'm not sure why he did it. I don't know if he revealed why he did it, but you look at his books and they're written right to left in backward script. He was a scientist. He determined many things like the height, pressure, the dependence of pressure in water on height, and a lot of other issues concerning light and how birds flew and so on. He was also an engineer. He would construct things. He devised a system for rerouting the Arno River. Never implemented, but it's still interesting nevertheless. He built battlements. He actually made quite a bit of money as an engineer when he moved from Florence to the city of Milan. And of course we know him as an artist. Developed new techniques that we'll talk about, and he was the defender of painting as the highest form of art. He believed that it was the epitome of creativity in art. Here's some of his military inventions. I'm intrigued with the very, very large crossbow. It must have been quite a cannon to launch a huge arrow many, many yards, as you could see by the size. He also developed a rapid fire arrow machine that looks somewhat like perhaps a gun that was a repeating gun, like a machine gun. He developed a tank. He explored aeronautics, developing a human flying machine as well as a helicopter. He did studies in anatomy, obtaining special permission to dissect bodies, which was illegal under Catholic regime, but he was allowed to do it. He was also a great technologist, inventing things like a bicycle and studies of various machines. The one on the right is one of my favorites. It shows meat being roasted on a spit, and the heat from the fire goes up, turns a fan, and that turns the spit so that the meat is roasted on all sides. He was also an architect, and he was an explorer of the scientific method. He was an interesting writer in his books on art. He, for instance, discussed the perfect face. Here's one of those beautiful, near-perfect faces that Leonardo drew. He used over 800 words to describe the ratios associated with the perfect face. Isn't that very Greek-like in his concepts? The Greeks believing that the face is a set of perfect ratios, and in fact the entire human body is designed according to perfect ratios. And Leonardo also believed that the human body was perfect ratios, and the Vitruvian Man, the famous Leonardo symbol, shows those ratios. Leonardo wrote, "Among all the studies and reasoning, light chiefly delights the beholder, and among the great features of mathematics, the certainty of its demonstrations is what preeminently tends to elevate the mind of the investigator. Perspective, therefore, must be preferred to all the discourses and systems of human learning. Clearly, Leonardo was caught up in the concepts of light, perspective, painting, and in his view, the highest form of art. Well, here's that same list of characteristics of Renaissance art that I showed in the last lecture. And I've indicated pre-Leonardo and post-Leonardo. Let's take a look now at each of those post-Leonardo developments and do them in terms of a real painting. The painting that I've chosen to illustrate this is called Madonna of the Rocks. There's actually two paintings that are almost identical. One of them in the Louvre and the other one in the National Gallery in London. Let's talk about what Leonardo contributed. First, a geometrical arrangement of the figures. Notice that the figures in this painting are quite triangular in their arrangement. That was seen by Leonardo as being a stable form and very pleasing to the eye. The second is a concept called chiaroscuro. That means light and dark. It is really the use of shadowing to enhance the roundness and reality of things. Notice in this painting that light is coming from the upper left, and therefore things on the lower right are in oscuro, they're in darkness. Sfumato is a technique that Leonardo used to soften the edges of real things like people and so on, especially people. And it was a cloudiness. Sfumato means a foggy or cloudiness. And you apply many layers, and as you apply those layers, it tends to soften the surfaces and the edges, making for a very realistic appearing person. Foreshortening is a perspective method that examines things that are thrust toward the viewer. So you notice here in this painting of Madonna of the Rocks, the hand of the Madonna is thrust forward, and it therefore is showing the concept of foreshortening. Background treatments tend to make use of one of the concepts of perspective called the atmospheric perspective. And in this particular case, not only are things in the background fuzzy, but they are almost always treated in a blue-gray haze, and that recedes that object from our eye. Finally, artists live on commissions. The Madonna of the Rocks is a good example of that. Leonardo had a commission to paint this painting, and he was making a lot of money off it. And then one day a man walked in and saw the painting nearly completed, and he offered to buy it on the spot. Leonardo sold it to him, and then to fulfill the commission, he had to paint the second painting. That's why we have two near copies of Madonna of the Rocks. All right, here's Leonardo's most famous painting, the Mona Lisa. Take a look at it. What do you see? What are the elements of Renaissance painting that are apparent in the Mona Lisa? Well, we can see certainly triangular arrangement with her head and her arms. We can see chiaroscuro with light on one side of her face and darkness on the other. We see a receding background with the blue-gray in the distance. We see sfumato with the softness of her hands. Clearly, the Mona Lisa shows all of these elements. Leonardo said, "Where the spirit does not work with the hands, there is no art." So he put himself into this painting, and he said that the Mona Lisa was his favorite painting of his own. That's perhaps one of the reasons it's so valuable. Now let's leave Leonardo da Vinci for a few moments and talk about Michelangelo. We'll come back to both of them together. Michelangelo was 13 years younger than Leonardo, also born near Florence. when Michelangelo was a young man, he actually moved into the home of Lorenzo the Magnificent and lived as a young boy in that household. Leonardo was a marvelous sculptor and quickly surpassed the art of his mentor who was teaching him how to sculpt. Here's a video that talks about Michelangelo's commission to sculpt the David. David was viewed by the city of Florence as their symbol, their city's mascot, if you will, or their city symbol. And therefore, the David by Michelangelo was a key sculpture. Let's take a look at what this video says about his development of that.
Florence, 1501. Home of the Italian Renaissance for nearly 200 years, it is a city at the heart of an artistic revolution. And now, in a workshop behind the cathedral, an extraordinary work of art was beginning to take form. A single 13-foot block of marble had stood for 35 years waiting for a sculptor brave enough to take on the challenge. That sculptor's name was Michelangelo Buonarroti.
Michelangelo lived for his work. He was, I think, by any standards, a workaholic. He rarely ate. He didn't sleep very much. He would often sit away in the dead of night with his hammer ringing away. He didn't take his boots off, apparently, for months at a time, so that when he did take them off, the skin came along with the boots.
The colossal project would take nearly 3 years to complete. To guide his progress, Michelangelo submerged a small wax model in water. Day by day, he let the level drop. And what Michelangelo saw emerging from the water, he chiseled carefully from his marble block. He also devised a constant shower of water to keep the dust down and his body cool. The giant Michelangelo was creating would come to symbolize his struggles against the family he had once adored.
Someone asked Michelangelo how he was able to sculpt, how he was able to put the lifelike characters into the stone, and he said, no, it's not that way. He quoted, a quote says, "In every block of marble, I see a statue as plain as though it stood before me, shaped and perfect in attitude and action. I have only to hew away the rough walls that imprison the lovely apparition to reveal it to the other eyes as mine see it." So he sees inside the stone, the finished art, and he just simply removes it. Here we see the David, the beautiful stare of his eyes, the somewhat distant gaze, looking perhaps at Goliath in the distance, the beautiful detail, the veins on his hands and the grip of the stones. It's just a marvelous, marvelous painting or sculpture. Here is a video that talks about a time when Leonardo and Michelangelo were asked to do paintings on either side of the main hall in the Signoria, the City Hall.
Leonardo was famed throughout Europe as the greatest artist of his time. But he knew there was another contender for his title: Michelangelo. And with the city under threat of invasion, the rival artists were brought face to face for an exercise in civic pride. Leonardo and Michelangelo were each given a wall of the Great Council chamber to decorate with frescoes of famous Florentine battles. It was a contest between two utterly contrasting characters.
Leonardo is the urbane, sophisticated, slightly dandyish figure, turns his hand to a bit of everything. Michelangelo, on the other hand, is this untutored genius, very difficult, very fragile, very bad-tempered. And the clash is very, very interesting, two very, very different styles.
Leonardo conceived of the Battle of Anghiari as a visceral and heroic action scene. No one had attempted such frenzied violence before. By contrast, Michelangelo's Battle of Cascina expressed panic on a very human scale. The artist had caught the mood of an apprehensive city.
A lot of competition between these two, and they were not able to finish because of that competition. Leonardo was somewhat resentful of Michelangelo, and he said, "Sculpture is not a science, but a very mechanical art, generally accomplished by great sweat, which mingles with dust and becomes converted into mud. His face, the sculpture's, becomes plastered and powdered all over with marble dust, which makes him look like a baker." Hence, Leonardo was somewhat arrogant in his attitude toward Michelangelo. Each day they would go and work in the same room, and they made sketches of 2 battle scenes, which was their commission. Eventually, Leonardo cracked. He could not take the pressure, and his painting was unfinished, and Leonardo left the city and went to Milan. Soon after, Michelangelo shrugged and said, "I cannot complete my work either," and he left Florence and he went to Rome. Neither work progressed, and eventually the walls were painted. There was insufficient work to save them. Today, all we have are the sketches that were made prior to anything be put on the wall. When Leonardo went to Milan, he needed to get a job. He needed some money. And it's interesting what he sold himself as in his resume to the Duke of Milan. He said that his accomplishments were, quote, "I have plans for bridges, very light and strong and suitable for carrying very easily. When a place is besieged, I know how to cut off water from the trenches and how to construct an infinite number of scaling ladders and other instruments." Many more engineering talents are listed in his resume. And then he says, "Also, I can execute sculpture in marble and bronze and clay, and also painting, in which my work will stand comparison with that of anyone else, whoever he may be." In Milan, Leonardo was given engineering duties. He was asked to sculpt a huge equestrian statue of the Duke of Milan, never fully completed because the bronze that was to be used for the statue was cast into cannons to try and defend the city against an invasion by the French. And Leonardo was able to do some painting. The most famous painting that he did in Milan is the Last Supper, and here we see a picture of it. Notice some issues about the Last Supper that are typical of the Renaissance. Strong perspective, linear perspective. The lines converge toward the back to a point just above the head of Christ. Notice that the background is this blue-gray, and the definition of objects in the background is fuzzy. Notice that there's a realism. The people in the painting, the apostles, seem to be caught in a moment, almost like a snapshot. There is chiaroscuro. Notice that the right-hand wall is light, and the left-hand wall, as we look at it, is in darkness. An interesting point is this painting is on the wall in what is called the refectory, which is a place where the monks ate. And so the feeling is that as the monks were eating, this table would be just a continuation of their table. And in fact, the light and window arrangement in the room would be characteristic of the light in the painting, showing lightness on one side and darkness on the other, just as would have been in the actual room itself. There is a door that has been cut out below that has destroyed part of the painting, and here we can see a restoration, a painting of what another artist thinks the original may have looked like. Leonardo made a mistake when he did the painting. He used a technique that was like fresco, but not traditional, and it did not work. Therefore, almost from the beginning, the painting started to deteriorate, and today it is in a sad shape because it has deteriorated so much. To try and preserve it, the monastery limits visits to 15 minutes, and they only allow 20 people in at a time, and to get into the room, you have to go through an airlock chamber. That combination of things is an attempt to try and preserve this beautiful wall painting. During World War II, there was actually a bomb that struck the monastery, but fortunately, it did very little damage to the fresco. When Michelangelo left Florence, he went to Rome. He was very disturbed, not only because of his confrontation with Leonardo, but the Medicis were at this point losing their power. Savonarola was gaining power, and Michelangelo listened to what Savonarola said, realized that his own works had been somewhat pagan, and he therefore vowed that he would never again do pagan works, and he kept that promise. He took commissions in Rome for art, mostly sculpture, but also, of course, the painting of the Sistine Chapel, which some believe is the greatest work of art ever done by anyone, anywhere. His first commission, however, was a sculpture, and it's called a Pietà. The Pietà is a pose. Many people have done Pietas, and Michelangelo's actually has two of them. The one in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome is by far the most important. And here we see a picture of it. It is a picture, a Pietà is Mary holding the dead body of Christ. Mary's face is beautiful. The folds of her robe are just magnificently done. And this sculpture was originally done for a cardinal, but it was put on public display, and others walked by. Michelangelo, a young man, stood not too far away and listened to what they said. And one viewer said to the other, "Isn't that a beautiful sculpture by Bramante?" And Michelangelo was outraged to think that someone else would get credit for his sculpture. And therefore, that night, Michelangelo got a hammer and chisel, and he went to the sculptor. And on the band across Mary's chest, he wrote, Michelangelo Buonarroti. That is his signature. And it's the only piece of work, of artwork done by Michelangelo that is signed. Another famous and beautiful work by Michelangelo is called The Moses. This was done as part of a planned collection of 30 some odd sculptures for Pope Julius II's tomb. Julius II died before the tomb was completed, and instead of being at the center of St. Peter's Basilica, as Julius wanted, it was put in another church called San Pietro in Cadena, which is not too far away, in Vincula, San Pietro in Vincula, which is not too far away from the Colosseum in Rome. And there you can go and see the Moses. Michelangelo looked at Moses and he said upon its completion, "You are so real," and he struck his knee and he said, "Arise, Moses." So it was obviously a very realistic piece, and as you see it, you are marveled at how realistic it looks. An interesting thing about the Moses is that he has horns. This comes from a mistranslation in the Latin Bible, and in that Latin Bible, the story says that when Moses came down from the mountain, the people looked at him and they saw his face and horns, or they saw his face and a beam or crown of light. Let me tell you why the or. In the Bible it said horns, but the three letters in Hebrew are actually translated into English as KRN, and there is no vowel. So it could have been Karen, which means light or beam, or it could have been Karnaim, which is the plural for horns. Therefore, it's unsure from just the Hebrew whether it would be horns or light or beam. Well, logically, I think, we would believe that it was a light or beam that radiated out from his head. But Jerome, when he translated the Bible, said it's going to be horns. This is, you might imagine, the same kind of thing. Perhaps you're familiar with Spanish. In Spanish, KRN would be CRN, and if you just had the three letters CRN, you might think that it would be Cuerno, C-U-E-R-N-O, but it might also be Corona, C-O-R-O-N-A. And in both cases, the consonants are C-R-N. And when you put in the vowels, it changes it from cuerno, horn, to corona, which is a crown or a light or beam. Therefore, we can see that the Hebrew dilemma would have been perpetuated in, say, Spanish or probably in Latin and others if the vowels were not added. Well, in the midst of his attempts to get the money and do the sculptures for Julius II's tomb, the Pope Julius II came to Michelangelo and requested, really demanded, that he paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And therefore, Michelangelo took the commission, and over a period of time, about 4 years, he was able to create this magnificent ceiling. Let's see a short video that talks about that wonderful creation.
For 4 years, Michelangelo had toiled on a major commission in Rome. The late Pope Julius II had commanded him to paint the ceiling of the papal chapel inside the Vatican. But the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel was 1,000 meters square. Michelangelo was convinced he was doomed to fail. Michelangelo resented every minute he spent on the Cappella Sistina.
This difficult position shoves my stomach up to hang beneath my chin. My loins have gone up into my belly, and I cannot see where to put my feet. and with its non-stop dripping from above, my brush makes my face a richly decorated floor.
Working in secret, a small group of long-suffering assistants helped Michelangelo with the most demanding work.
With fresco, you have anywhere from 12 to 24 hours to create your masterpiece. Fresco was regarded as the most difficult method of painting. It was said that many painters could master painting in oil, but only the very best could succeed at fresco.
Michelangelo covered the ceiling with around 300 figures and stories from the Bible, among them the flood, the origin of the stars, and the creation of Adam. Michelangelo's monumental figures were based on fragments of classical sculptures and inspired by the perfection and beauty of the ancient world. Out of reluctance and frustration, Michelangelo had crafted brilliance, arguably the greatest work of art of the Renaissance.
Here we see the marvelous ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Down the spine of the ceiling, we see the major events from Genesis. We see the creation of Adam, the story of the garden. We see Noah, Abraham. It's all down that beautiful ceiling. Others are prophets of the Old Testament. And then behind the altar is another fresco by Michelangelo. This was done a few years later, but it is the Last Judgment. We see Christ coming and casting the evil down into hell, raising those righteous in the resurrection into heaven. It is a magnificent, magnificent work as well. St. Peter's, which is next door to the Sistine Chapel, is also a contribution by Michelangelo. He was not the first architect, but he was one of the latter architects. Michelangelo lived many years, and toward the end of his life, he was given the commission of doing some of the architecture work on St. Peter's, in particular the dome. There was a young man who had come to Rome. First he left his city of Urbino, and then he went to Florence, and then after Florence he came to Rome when Michelangelo was there. This young man was named Raphael. Raphael was a very interesting painter, a quick study. He could very quickly copy the style of someone else. And Michelangelo felt threatened by Raphael. At exactly the time that Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel, Raphael was painting the Pope's private quarters. And when you go to Rome and you want to see the Sistine Chapel, you do that by going into the Vatican Museum. You go around the corner from St. Peter's, it's quite a little walk away, and you walk through the Vatican Museum towards St. Peter's, and as you get to the end of that tour, you get to the Pope's private chambers, and you can see there the work of Raphael. School of Athens is the most famous of those paintings. And then you go out the door of the Pope's chambers, down the stairs, and you go into the Sistine Chapel. And then as you come out of the Sistine Chapel at the back, you go down some stairs and you enter into St. Peter's. And so they're all very close. It would have been unthinkable that Raphael and Michelangelo's works would not have been compared. And that may have been some of the urging, the pressure on Michelangelo and on Raphael to create these two great works. Here is a shot of Raphael then. He's a young man, quite handsome. Michelangelo was not a handsome person. Michelangelo was older by about a half a generation. And Michelangelo lived as a recluse, whereas Raphael was very, very popular and well-liked. Here is School of Athens. You can see perspective. You can see chiaroscuro. You can see realism. The two men in the center, one with the long beard, represents Plato, and the person that Raphael used as the model for Plato was Leonardo da Vinci. Michelangelo is also in here. He is not one of the two principals. He's down toward the front, and he doesn't look so good. He looks a little sad. Raphael put himself into the painting as well. He's on the far right, showing just his face. There are many great people represented here, and here I show a plan with numbers showing some of those people, identifying who is who in the painting. I'm sure that many of the others are intended to be specific people in the past, but we're just unaware of who they are. Notice this painting by Raphael, and I'd like you to make a few notes about its composition and technique. Again, it is a Madonna. We see John the Baptist and Christ as the two children. It's a very common scene. Compare it to Madonna of the Rocks, and there are some obvious differences, but let's focus on the similarities. Triangular arrangement. Background is blue-gray. Chiaroscuro is somewhat similar, as even coming from the upper left. The faces have some similarity. So you can see that the style that Raphael used is blatantly similar, maybe even a copy of the style of Leonardo. And for that reason, there's some friction between people who think that Raphael may not have been too creative. Here's a question for you. If you copy concepts and you copy themes and you adapt works of others, is that creative? Or do you have to do something that is totally unique? Even if you do it really well, do you have to do something totally unique? That's an interesting question on creativity. I have to tell you a little dream. This is a picture of Urbino. It is the home of Raphael. My dream is to go to this beautiful little mountain village city and spend 2 or 3 months and study the life of Raphael, study the lives of the Duke of Urbino and his children, and write a book. This is a Renaissance Eden, a place where life was perfect for a while, and then came a snake. He was the son of the Pope, Cesare Borgia, and he destroyed this beautiful Eden. Luckily, he died, and he died soon enough that the Duke and Duchess were able to return to Urbino and reestablish this little secluded Renaissance Eden, a beautiful place. Doesn't that sound like fun? Wouldn't you like to go with me and help me write the book of Renaissance Eden? Let's talk about Renaissance music. It's important. It is the beginning of modern music. Up until this time, music was totally and completely dominated by the church. With Renaissance music, we still have principally church music, but there are other forms of music that are starting to become important. Let's do a little discussion about Renaissance music. Words still dominate. The reason that they dominate is because in the Mass, it is a covenant that people are making, and therefore it is important for the people to hear the words. And the Mass still dominates music during the Renaissance period. But in other places where the words are not fixed, that is in popular music, there is a concept called tone painting. Tone painting is simply that the words dictate the way the music goes. So if the words talk about something that is, let's go up the hill, then the music goes up the hill. And if the words talk about, he descended into the depths of hell, then the music goes into the depths of hell. So tone painting is simply allowing the music to follow the meaning of the words. That shows the dominance of the words still throughout the Renaissance period. Now, I'd like to talk about a technical term in music. It's called texture. Texture means that there is a type of music associated with the number of melodies and their interaction. For instance, throughout the medieval period, the Middle Ages, we have music that is dominated by monophonic texture. Mono means one, and phonic means sound or voice or melody. And therefore, monophonic means one voice, and it means unity or unison. And therefore, typical of medieval chant, there is one melody line, and everybody sings it together. That's monophonic. In the Renaissance, we get a new kind of texture. It's called polyphonic. That means many melodies or many voices. And so what we get is a main melody line, and then another main melody line, and another main melody line. All of the melodies have equal weight. That's called polyphonic. In the late Renaissance, we get yet another type of texture, and it's called homophonic. That means that there is a main melody line, and all other melodies are supportive of the main one. They may be lesser quality melodies, that is, they're not as melodic, they're more rhythmic or they're more harmonic in their nature, and therefore the one melody line with everything else supporting it is called homophonic, and that becomes the principal texture for modern music. There's still some polyphonic and still some monophonic, but clearly after the Renaissance, homophonic becomes more and more important. The harmonies that are used during this period, that is the actual way that the notes are sounded together, are based on the principles developed during the time of Pythagoras in ancient Greece. And it's called the Pythagorean tuning system. And therefore the melodies of the Renaissance are copied on ancient Greece. It is again another way that ancient Greek culture was being reborn. As I mentioned, the Mass is still a dominant force behind music. The Catholic Church enjoyed having music in support of the Mass, not the other way around, and therefore words are important. The Mass is divided generally into two parts. One of those portions is called the proper, the other one is called the ordinary. The proper changes from day to day. Every day of the year has a particular Mass that is said for that day. Might be Easter, might be Christmas, might be Ascension, might be Pentecost. The other part of the Mass, the ordinary, is fixed. It never changes. And therefore, most of the music that is composed for the Mass is composed for the ordinary, so that it can be played often. You'd like your music to be heard more than once a year, so it accompanies the words associated with the ordinary. There was a problem within the Catholic Church with respect to music. The popes began to feel that there was too much complexity in the music. It was just simply drowning out the words, and it was so polyphonic that it became troublesome for the popes. And therefore they commanded that polyphonic music could no longer be used. They were demanding to go back to monophonic music. There was a man who was working in Rome, in the Vatican. His name was Palestrina. And Palestrina went to the Pope and asked for permission to compose a Mass that was polyphonic, but he promised the Pope that it would support the words of the Mass and not conflict or override them. He dedicated some of these Masses to the Pope. Not a stupid man, Palestrina. Here is an example of the Pope Marcellus Mass, and I think you can hear how beautiful it sounds and how the words come through very, very clearly. And yet, it is polyphonic in nature, and that means it has more than one principal melody. Take a listen. Palestrina is revered today. He's buried in St. Peter's. He is called the Prince of Music, and many, many composers have cited Palestrina's music as being critical for their own development. Well, now let's spend a moment or two and talk about secular music. The most important secular music in the Renaissance period were madrigals. These are poetry set to music, again, principally dominated by the words. Let's take a listen to Now is the Month of Maine, which is a secular song. And I think you can hear some of the tone painting where the music reflects the meaning of the words.
Now is the month of May, when merry lads are playing, fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. Now is the month of May, when merry lads are playing, fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. Each with his bonny lass upon the greeny grass, fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. Each with his bonny lass upon the greeny grass, fa la 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 la. The spring-clad all in gladness doth laugh at winter's sadness, fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. The spring glad all in gladness, just laugh at winter's sadness. Fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. And to the bagpipe sound, the nymphs tread up the ground. Fa la 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 la. And to the bagpipe sound, the nymphs tread up the ground. Fa la 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 la. Why then, why sit we musing, you sweet delight refusing? Fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. Why then, why sit we musing, you sweet delight refusing? Fa la 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 la, fa la 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 la. Say, dainty nymphs, and speak, shall we play barley break? Fa la 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 la. Say, dainty nymphs, and speak, shall we play barley break? La 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 la.
Dances became important during the Renaissance period as well. And here's an example of a sprightly dance by Susato. Delightful music, wasn't it? Now let's talk about the end of the Renaissance. There is an event that many people say was the event that ended the Renaissance. What happened was that the German-Spanish army had been combined under the control of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And they had been fighting in Germany and fighting in Austria and fighting in northern Italy. And this combined army descended on the city of Rome. You would ask, why would they fight Rome? They were not enemies of the Pope, but Charles V wanted to teach the Pope a lesson. There had been some friction between them. And therefore, Charles V didn't command the army to go into Rome. He just allowed them to go into Rome. And this army that had been fighting for many months, largely without compensation, went into the city of Rome and simply destroyed it. It's called the Sack of Rome. It happened in 1527. Here's a short video discussing the problems that occurred during the Sack of Rome.
But to the men surrounding Rome, there was nothing that remained sacred about the Catholic Church. Many were followers of Luther, now fueled by deep religious hatred. In fear of his life, Clement fled to the safety of the Castel Sant'Angelo. Fears were justified. For the next day, Rome was torn apart without mercy.
About 8,000 people died on the first day. This was just massacre on an absolutely grand scale. The sack of Rome is probably one of the blackest moments that takes place in the Renaissance.
After 7 months under siege, Clement perfected his plan for escape. Changing his robes for rags, he had the papal jewels removed from their settings, and all the gold melted down. With his treasures sewn into his clothes, Clement bribed his way out of Rome.
There are men that we should remember from the Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, and others, early Renaissance people like Petrarch, late Renaissance people like Erasmus, early Renaissance man Pico della Mirandola. These men were experts in many fields, and therefore we call them Renaissance men. But what does it mean to be a Renaissance man besides being familiar with many fields? Remember, I said experts in many fields. What that means is that they had pursued at least one field, and probably more than that, at such a depth that they were experts in that field and experts in others. It's not just shallow. It is depth and breadth all together that makes a Renaissance man. These people were truly creative because they could jump from one subject to another. They could open one file drawer and jump to another file drawer. Their minds were brilliant. Their method of thinking was brilliant. They were creative. They used both the right and the left side. Why were there so many of these men during the Renaissance period? I think because it was a period in which creativity was respected and rewarded, and there was value in being a creative person, and therefore these men stepped forward and they took that value. I'd like you to emulate the Renaissance people, and if you have to pick one, why not pick Leonardo? Learn about a lot of things, and hopefully this class can help you. Thank you.